There are certain moments in television history that no amount of rehearsal could have manufactured, moments where the careful lighting and scripted banter and practiced charms simply surrendered to something more powerful and more human. Johnny Carson presided over 30 years of those moments, and if you study his career closely enough, a pattern emerges buried beneath the laughter and the monologues and the legendary interviews. Specific evenings, specific entrances, specific women, where Carson, the most controlled and professionally polished host television has ever produced, briefly, visibly, undeniably lost his composure. Not in any dramatic way, because Carson was far too disciplined for that. What you noticed instead was something subtler, a pause that lasted half a second too long, a glance downward at note cards he had already memorized, a laugh that arrived just a little too quickly. Small cracks in a professional facade perfected over decades of live television, and those cracks, precisely because they were so rare, told you everything about what was happening behind them. Carson never published a list. He never sat for an interview where he ranked the women who had affected him most deeply, and what we know comes instead from the people who worked alongside him for years: producers, camera operators, writers, talent coordinators, people who watched him from 15 feet away every single night and learned to read him the way a musician learns to read a conductor. They noticed what home audiences could not. They saw him before the red light came on and after it went off, heard the offhand comments made during commercial breaks, the observations shared over drinks after long tapings, the private assessments of guests that never made it to any broadcast. From those fragments, assembled over decades, a picture emerges of 8 women who did something that almost nothing and almost no one else could do. They got to him. And the story of how they did it turns out to be far more interesting than any simple ranking of beauty could ever be. Raquel Welch appeared on Carson's stage multiple times over the years, and the reason had nothing to do with NBC executives wanting the ratings bump her name reliably delivered. Carson controlled his guest list with a famously firm hand and could have resisted booking her repeatedly if he had wanted to, but he didn't want to, and the people who worked closely with him understood why. Every single time she appeared, remembered one camera operator who worked her segments, the reaction in that studio was physical, not excited, not enthusiastic, but physical. The kind of collective response that bypasses the thinking brain entirely. Camera operators who had spent years training themselves to hold steady on their marks would drift slightly, instinctively following her across the stage in ways that were technically unnecessary but humanly inevitable. What separated Welch from the dozens of other extraordinarily beautiful women who crossed Carson's stage was a quality that producers struggled to name but universally recognized. Every movement carried intention behind it, the angle of her head when she laughed, the precise moment she chose to hold eye contact, and the precise moment she chose to look away. All of it considered and controlled and deployed with the awareness of someone who understood exactly what effect she was creating. Carson, who spent his career studying human behavior with what one longtime producer called almost scientific precision, recognized that calculation immediately and respected it enormously. He once told his producer off camera that she doesn't enter a room, she takes it over, and the word choice matters here because taking over is an active thing that requires intention and skill. Anyone can walk into a room. Welch arrived in them. The moments where his famous composure visibly fractured during her appearances became something the crew quietly collected over the years. One appearance in particular stood out, recalled a producer who was present, where the dress she wore prompted Carson to begin a question. Lose it completely mid-sentence, look down at his blue cards, look back up, and say with complete sincerity, "I'm sorry, what was I saying?" The audience roared because the reason was obvious to everyone in the room, but what made it memorable wasn't the distraction itself, it was how rare the distraction was. Carson almost never got flustered on air, and the fact that it happened more than once with Welch was a tribute no award ceremony could have matched. What he privately admired most, according to those he shared these reflections with, was not the beauty, but the self-knowledge. She had made peace with what she represented in the cultural imagination without apologizing for it or pretending it was something other than what it was, and Johnny once told a talent coordinator that she understands exactly who she is and what she represents, which in an industry built on image management and careful distance from one's own constructed persona amounted to the rarest of compliments. The transformation that occurred in Studio One when Sophia Loren arrived for her Tonight Show appearance in 1979 carried a different character entirely from what Welch created, and Carson noticed the difference immediately. Where Welch projected deliberate, almost architectural glamour, Loren brought something older and more elemental, a European sophistication that seemed to operate by entirely different rules than the Hollywood beauty he had spent 3 decades interviewing. Loren had grown up in war-torn Naples, built her career in the demanding tradition of Italian neo-realist cinema, and been shaped by poverty and difficulty in ways that left marks invisible to cameras but unmistakable to anyone paying close enough attention. Carson was paying attention. A director who worked that first appearance remembered watching his body. Language shift almost immediately after she sat down, leaning forward more than usual, laughing slightly more readily than his characteristic detachment typically allowed, touching his tie in the unconscious, self-checking gesture that those who knew him well recognized as a signal he had been genuinely caught off guard. What Loren did with her time in Carson's chair refused to be reduced to the obvious. Where interviewers with less intelligence and less respect might have been content to let her beauty fill the airtime, she consistently redirected conversations toward the substance of her experience, the Italian cinema traditions that formed her, the navigation between European and American film cultures, the childhood that had given her a relationship with hardship most Hollywood stars could not imagine. Her eyes would lock onto Carson's when she was making a point, and according to a writer who prepared questions for her segments, Carson would visibly be working to hold the thread of the interview even as the force of her attention threatened to dissolve it. There was one moment, the same writer recalled, where she put her hand on his arm to emphasize something she was describing, and the control room paused collectively, waiting to see whether the host of television's most polished talk show would need a commercial break to reassemble himself. He recovered smoothly, as he always did, but the pause before he recovered was real. The Tonight Show staff, a group not known for, first, reverence prepared for Loren's appearances with what one crew member could only describe as something approaching ceremony. And none of the usual backstage joking took place when she was booked because people stood straighter and spoke more quietly, responding not just to how she looked, but to the accumulated weight of a life and a career that had genuinely meant something. Bo Derek walked onto Carson's stage in late 1979, and the silence that followed her entrance was something those who were there have spent years trying to describe accurately. The film 10 had turned her into America's newest and most discussed fantasy almost overnight, and the Tonight Show audience arrived already knowing who she was, already carrying expectations, but the gap between expectation and the reality of her in person in 3 dimensions, occupying actual physical space, produced a stunned, quiet, unlike the usual enthusiastic reception Carson's guests received. An NBC page managing the audience that night remembered having to ask people to remain in their seats, which was not a request that was usually necessary. The camera actually diminished her rather than enhanced her, recalled a talent coordinator, which almost never happens with celebrities. Most beautiful people look the way the camera sees them, or the camera improves on them slightly, but Derek was somehow more than the camera could contain. What struck Carson most deeply about her, and what he discussed afterward with a quality of, first, genuine wonder unusual for him, was not the extraordinary physical beauty itself, but the apparent disconnect between that beauty and her self-awareness of it. She seemed to have no calculated relationship with the idea of what she was doing to rooms when she entered them, arriving without an entourage, without lighting requirements, without pre-approved topics, without the apparatus of celebrity management that surrounded almost every other major star who came through his stage door. The pre-interview team was thrown off by the absence of any apparent agenda, and Carson, in conversation with a producer after her first appearance, described her with a simplicity that constituted the highest possible praise from a man who had seen everything. She has no idea how beautiful she is, and that makes her twice as beautiful. The observation was typically Carson in its precision, not a compliment on her appearance, but an insight into her psychology. And an insight that revealed as much about what he valued as it did about what he observed in her. Elizabeth Taylor's 1992 visit occupied a different category entirely, and everyone in the building knew it from the moment the booking was confirmed. NBC executives who typically left Carson's program to run itself attended pre-production meetings. Lighting got adjusted specifically to capture what a director's rundown note referred to simply as the eyes a note that the director later recalled having never received before or since for any other guest, Carson himself, who maintained a firm policy of not meeting with guests before their on-air appearance because he wanted the interview to feel genuinely spontaneous, made an exception and went to greet her personally before the taping began. That exception alone told you something about how he understood the magnitude of what was about to happen. A stage manager who worked the night remembered a palpable shift in the atmosphere of the building from the moment she arrived, a sense that they were hosting not just a celebrity, but a piece of history. Other guests walked in. The cameraman put it plainly. Taylor arrived. The distinction was not metaphorical. She moved at a different pace than other celebrities. Acknowledged the standing ovation with a slight nod that managed to be simultaneously gracious and imperial, and created the fascinating dynamic of an audience that seemed to understand it was offering tribute rather than applause. What Carson found most compelling about her and what he discussed in private with genuine admiration was her relationship with her own iconic status. Taylor understood exactly what she represented, the last living connection to a Hollywood era that had essentially ceased to exist, and she carried that understanding without false modesty or insufferable grandeur, simply embodying it the way a person embodies their own history, because they have no alternative. Carson had watched celebrity culture transform over 3 decades from something guarded and mysterious into something increasingly confessional and exposed, and he respected her maintenance of the old mystique with something close to reverence. After the taping, he told a producer, "You don't see that anymore. That kind of grand stardom, she doesn't give everything away, she keeps something for herself." In a media environment already beginning its long march toward total transparency and constant accessibility, Taylor's reserve was not merely personal preference, it was a philosophical position, and Carson recognized it as such. Farrah Fawcett created a force of an entirely different kind. By 1976, the red swimsuit poster had already sold 12 million copies. And when she made her first Tonight Show appearance that same year shortly after Charlie's Angels premiered, the studio audience's reaction was so sustained and so genuinely uncontrollable that the footage had to be edited down for broadcast, a rare instance of the show's editors having too much appreciative noise to work with. An NBC page who managed audiences for hundreds of tapings described the reaction to her first entrance as unlike anything he had witnessed before or since, not the reverent hush of a Taylor or a Lauren, not the stunned silence of a Derek, but actual joy, spontaneous and infectious, the kind of response that bypassed celebrity worship entirely and went straight to something simpler and more immediate. Carson told his producer after that first appearance that she was like human champagne, that the whole room felt more bubbly when she was in it. And the observation captured something real about the specific quality she brought to the room. What he appreciated about her, beyond the obvious, was her spontaneity, a quality that aligned with his own deepest preferences as an interviewer and a performer. Fawcett seemed incapable of being calculated, willing to follow him into conversational territory that other, more strategic guests would have steered away from, and a moment involving a hairbrush and a dare became legendary among the staff, not because it was planned, but because it absolutely wasn't. She simply handed Carson the brush and suggested he demonstrate his styling technique, and he, normally the most physically restrained of hosts, stood up and made several genuinely terrified attempts at her famous waves while the audience lost its collective composure. The flirtatious chemistry between them was real but never uncomfortable, a playful back and forth that worked because both of them were equally willing to be unguarded. Carson once remarked privately that she was beautiful in a way that seemed like good health rather than good genes, connected to sunshine and tennis courts and swimming pools rather than lucky biology or careful image construction. And coming from someone who had spent 30 years observing how beauty could be manufactured and packaged and strategically deployed, that observation amounted to the highest praise. he could offer. Diane Carroll brought something to Carson's stage that none of the other women on this list brought, and he recognized and honored it in ways that went beyond the typical courtesies extended to beautiful and famous guests. With Julia in 1968, Carroll had become the first black woman to star in her own network television series in a non-stereotypical role, and that historical fact sat quietly but permanently behind every conversation she had in that chair. A producer who worked many of her appearances recalled that she always appeared completely composed when she sat down, as though interviewing with the most powerful man in television was simply another Tuesday, and that self-possession, combined with an intelligence she never softened or obscured to seem more approachable, created a presence that was simultaneously warm and quietly authoritative. Carson told his producer after one appearance that she can make important points without ever seeming like she's lecturing. And in someone who prided himself on recognizing rare gifts, that observation carried real weight. What made Carroll particularly effective was her refusal to let the interview stay only where comfortable. She would gently, gracefully redirect conversations toward territory that mattered to her, the limited opportunities still available to black actresses, the responsibility she felt as a pioneering figure, the navigation of an industry that had historically treated people who looked like her as either invisible or stereotypical. The writer who recalled one such redirection noted that she did it with such natural authority that it created no awkwardness, that Carson immediately followed her into the new terrain, and that the whole exchange demonstrated something she possessed that few guests in 30 years had managed: the ability to bring substance to a stage designed for entertainment without sacrificing any of the entertainment in the process. Her fashion choices reinforced the same message her bearing communicated, because while other stars chased seasonal trends, Carroll arrived in impeccably tailored classic outfits that looked simultaneously current and timeless, and Carson, whose own tastes ran deeply traditional, once told a producer that she dresses like someone who respects both herself and her audience, which coming from him amounted to a significant declaration. Ursula Andress arrived on Carson's stage carrying the weight of a single cinematic embada moment that had already entered mythology by the time she first sat across from him. The white bikini, the Caribbean water, the scene from Dr. No, that sequence had not merely launched her career, but established a template for action film glamour that would be imitated and referenced and parodied for decades. An NBC executive who was present for her first appearance described her beauty as having something almost mythological about it, a combination of European directness and primal sensuality that created a different quality of attention in the room than any more familiar Hollywood glamour could produce. Carson, introducing the night's guests, looked at the green room monitor where she was visible and stopped mid-sentence, and for the most prepared and thoroughly professional host in the history of the medium, that pause was the equivalent of a standing ovation. What she did with the conversation that followed was characteristically European in the best sense. She answered questions without calculation, without the layers of image management and strategic self-presentation that surrounded almost every American celebrity who came through the green room. When Carson asked about the famous scene and its impact on her life, she didn't deflect into false modesty or affected surprise. What she said instead, according to a writer who was present, was simply and directly that of course it changed everything, that one does not create a moment like that and expect life to remain the same. Carson told his producer afterward that he found that kind of honesty tremendously appealing in an industry built on pretense, and he once remarked to that same producer that Andress didn't seem to need America's approval, meaning it as the highest possible form of praise. She brought a self-assurance that was genuinely self-contained, not performed for the room and not dependent on the reaction it received, and for a man who had spent 30 years distinguishing between what was real and what was constructed in the people who sat across from him. That quality was something he never stopped finding extraordinary. And then there is the name on this list that doesn't quite belong on it because she never sat in that chair. Marilyn Monroe died in August 1962, just months before Carson took over as permanent host. And the missed crossing of their careers stayed with him quietly for decades. She became, over his 30-year tenure, a recurring reference point, the benchmark against which he occasionally measured Hollywood glamour, the ultimate guest who had gotten away, the name he might invoke after an appearance by someone particularly extraordinary, as if to acknowledge that even the extraordinary existed in relationship to something that remained permanently beyond it. A longtime producer who worked with Carson through most of his tenure confirmed that Monroe always topped the list when conversations turned to dream guests he never got to interview, and what he believed he would have found a belief that grew more sophisticated as his own career aged and his understanding of the machinery of celebrity deepened, was not the sex goddess the public had been sold, but the intelligent, wounded, artistically serious person producing that performance for an audience that preferred the performance to the person. Carson had a theory, recalled someone who knew him well, that beneath the manufactured image lives someone with genuine artistic aspirations and genuine psychological. First, complexity, exactly the kind of person who brought out his best instincts as an interviewer. A writer who worked with him in his later years described Monroe as haunting the stage without ever stepping on it, and the observation was precise. Her absence was itself a presence, the shape of a conversation that never happened and couldn't be recovered, and in Carson's private accounting of 30 years behind that desk, the most beautiful silence turned out to be the one that belonged to the woman who never got the chance to fill it.